animals, including raising animals to protect livestock. Now, this lifestyle change also resulted in different kinds of diets. For example, the Kyrgyz of the Pamir Mountains in northern Afghanistan live at a high altitude where no crops grow. So their survival depends on the animals that they milk, butcher, and barter. Whereas the people of Crete, the largest of the Greek islands, eat a rich variety of foods that are drawn from their groves and from farms by the sea. They lived on a so-called Mediterranean diet long before it became a fad. Now, clearly, there are many different ways that humans have survived on food and that have resulted in these different kinds of diets. I won't be focusing on the effects of different diets in this talk or on the microbiome, though it could certainly be the focus of an entire presentation. I also won't be covering dietary practices that receive routine media coverage, such as the Atkins, Paleo, South Beach, high protein, Mediterranean, and of course the recent interest in the ketogenic diet. Instead, what I'm going to focus on is the role of food-related behaviors and the relationship to brain-body signaling within the nervous system in eating disorders. Now, there's no doubt that modern humans have a complex relationship with food. There's also no question that in today's Western society, humans have the easiest access to the largest amount of food and the most combination of foods in the Earth's history, and with the least amount of skill required to obtain them, as you can imagine from perhaps your weekly strolling through the supermarket aisle. Now, the abundant access to food in Western cultures has also led to considerable preoccupation with different forms of eating, what other people are eating, how best to prepare it. So this is from the cooking show Iron Chef, and how much can be eaten. We have eating competitions. This is actually a sign from a restaurant a couple hundred miles away from my institute, where if you can eat a 72-ounce steak in one sitting, they will give you your meal for free. Now, in the context of this abundant access to food, it's also clear that the United States and many other regions of the developed world are currently experiencing an obesity epidemic. One of the clearest links so far is related to evidence of increased caloric intake and reduced physical activity resulting in increased body mass. So this is actually a map related to the National Health and Nutrition Survey. And what it shows, I'm just going to go through this quickly, it shows the percentage of individuals in each state in the US who are overweight, categorized as a BMI of 30 or more. And what you can see, starting in 1986, there's been sort of a dramatic escalation in the percentage of individuals who are overweight. Now, this was in 2010. So in 1990, no state had an obesity prevalence greater to or equal than 15%. In 2010, no state had an obesity prevalence less than 20%, and that was 12 years ago. You can see that the obesity trends across multiple studies have increased in males and females. And so one question is whether differences in diet, activity level, and easy access to food resulted in different metabolic requirements. In other words, did humans relying solely on foraging have a need for greater calories to survive than humans living on Western diets? So this is where the study by Ponser and colleagues provides an answer that is pretty clearly no. So in the study of the Hadza hunter-gatherers, Ponser found that there were no estimated differences in energy expenditure or calories burned between the Hadza, these hunter-gatherers in red, and their Western counterparts, as you can see in gray. In other words, the Hadza foragers burn calories at the same rate relative to their body mass as their Western counterparts. So if metabolic rates haven't changed and body mass and obesity rates have been increasing, then increased food intake is certainly one culprit in the obesity pandemic. And what you can see is that you see an increase, substantial increase in the US in the sizing of portions that have been provided in restaurants over the past 60 years. Now, I could spend a whole lecture deriving possible causes and neurobiological factors associated with the obesity epidemic, but that's beyond the scope of the current talk. It's also important to note that while obesity has been linked with elevated rates of mental health disorders, such as mood and anxiety disorders, it's actually not considered a mental health disorder according to the US and international classification systems. So I won't be talking about obesity further. I do want to emphasize, however, that there are a variety of different eating behaviors that have been described over history and human societies. And these are not necessarily linked to the obesity epidemic that I just described, but they relate to reduced food intake behaviors such as religious fasting, political demonstrations such as hunger strikes, as well as increased food intake dating back to medieval times and even Roman orgies that were described. And what I would also note is that these eating behaviors were not necessarily considered pathological, although they were associated with differences in the pattern of food intake. There's also different body features that have been linked with societal ideals of beauty. I think what's important about this is this notion, perhaps best articulated by Margaret Wolfe Hungerford in this book, Molly Bond, that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. In other words, what one society or one individual considers to be beautiful may differ from another, but across human history, there's quite a variety of shapes and forms that have been considered preferential, and the associated attempts to achieve them have varied accordingly. Now, for the rest of the talk, we're going to be focusing on eating disorders, which are psychiatric disorders that are associated with disruptions in eating behaviors. Before we start talking about specific eating disorders, what I'd like to do is just review a few definitions that are relevant to health, brain, and behavior. So the first is that psychiatry is a branch of medicine that is primarily involved in the treatment of disorders affecting the mind, brain, and behavior. Symptoms are defined as the subjective sense, so an individual's own sense that something physical or mental is abnormal. Disorders are clusters of co-occurring symptoms that cause functional impairment, and this will be relevant as we start talking about disorders of eating and the associated history. Disorders can be differentiated from diseases, which are conditions that impair normal functioning of parts of the body in identifiable ways that are linked to a known disease mechanism. So an example that is pretty relevant would be something like Huntington's disease, which we know is a genetic condition associated with the trinucleotide repeat, such that people with a certain number of these repeats in their genome are destined to have Huntington's disease and manifest the syndrome or manifest the condition. With disorders, we don't necessarily have the same understanding in terms of what is causing them, but we try to understand them by looking at the associations of symptoms. So there are several categories of eating disorders in the current diagnostic nosology of DSM, and I'll talk briefly about each of them just so you get a sense of the range. So binge eating disorder is a relatively recently defined psychiatric disorder that's often associated with obesity but is distinct. It is characterized by recurrent episodes of eating large amounts of food and a sense of loss of control. It's probably the most prevalent eating disorder at about 3.5% of the lifetime prevalence estimate. Anorexia nervosa is a psychiatric disorder defined by severe food restriction that causes substantial weight loss. It's associated with intense fears of gaining weight and disturbed body image perception. So those are sort of the three core diagnostic criteria for AN. Bulimia nervosa is a psychiatric disorder that's defined by regular episodes of eating large amounts of food, repeated attempts to prevent the associated weight gain, as well as body image disturbance. A newer and more recently recognized condition is called Arfid, or Avoidant Restrictive Food Intake Disorder, which is something identified predominantly in childhood and associated with low interest in food and avoidance of food based on the perceived sensory characteristics. And finally, unspecified eating disorder would be a disorder of abnormal eating behavior that does not meet criteria for another eating disorder. Now, what I'd like to emphasize are a few things. There are currently estimated at about 30 million individuals in the US who could be diagnosed with an eating disorder. Yet these are pretty rare at any particular given time. So Anorexia nervosa, for example, is only about 1% of the population. The other thing is that the diagnostic categorizations for eating disorders are subject to change. And that's based on the DSM or the International Classification of Disease, or ICD. So this is just an illustration of the fact that the DSM started originally in 1952, and you can see that as the definitions have evolved, the book itself, the number of conditions has actually grown. And what's relevant, for example, is with binge eating disorder. Binge eating disorder was actually introduced in DSM-4 in 1994 as a subcategory of eating disorder not otherwise specified. And then in 2013, it became recognized as a separate diagnostic entity. So our understanding of what is an eating disorder is continuing to evolve. And in fact, this year, we just updated the DSM with a revision as well. So the other thing is that you may consider eating disorders to be on somewhat of a spectrum. So there may be many folks, in fact, who are commonly diagnosed, perhaps even more commonly diagnosed with an unspecified eating disorder rather than one of these disorders above. The other thing is that from a clinical perspective, when you follow people long enough, you may find that people have multiple diagnoses over time. So somebody might start with an unspecified eating disorder, and then they may be diagnosed with anorexia nervosa or bulimia nervosa or something else. For the remainder of the talk, in terms of the research I'll be showing, I'm going to be focusing primarily on data on anorexia nervosa. So we'll talk a little bit in more detail about that condition. So I want to start with the year of 1684, which was the same year that Newton's laws of motion and gravitation were described. Dr. Richard Morton in England described a male and a female adolescent whom he described as suffering from instances of nervous consumption or a wasting away due to emotional turmoil. This is widely considered to be the first sort of case report of what eventually was described and named as anorexia nervosa by Dr. Williams Gull and Charles Lassogue in the late 1800s. So the characteristics in the patients that they were seeing in London included going from a normal state of appearance and weight to extreme thinness, occasional binge eating, restlessness, anxiety, and increased activity. They also noted that there were some purging behaviors, vomiting, and attempts at excessive exercise. Following these descriptions, an increasing number of patients with the condition were subsequently defined in the medical literature. And from the late 1900s to the modern day, anorexia nervosa has received increasing scientific study. So this is just an example over the past century or so, the number of articles in the English language published on anorexia nervosa, and you can see the trend has gone up. This is an example in relation to major depressive disorder. And while this may look to be a fairly similar trajectory overall, I would point your attention to the y-axis here, which is unequal. So when we put these on the same axis, what you can see is that anorexia nervosa is relatively numerically far understudied relative to major depressive disorder. Another important point is that funding for eating disorders research is also typically very low. This was an estimate from about 5 years ago in terms of federal funding, that when you looked at the relative dollars spent per affected individual, so individuals with eating disorders have a similar prevalence to those with autism or schizophrenia, you can see that the amount of money spent to understand this condition or these sets of conditions was relatively low. Now, in a clinical setting, anorexia nervosa, I mentioned some of the diagnostic features, which include this severe restriction causing low body weight, fears of gaining weight, as well as a body image disturbance or an overvaluation of the weight and shape. This is sort of a pictorial example of an individual who's looking at the number on the scale. You can see that they're fairly slender, but she's quite worried because she actually perceives herself in a way that does not really represent what other people see or the numbers that are on the scale. Now, these are the three sort of diagnostic features that are necessary for a clinician to say yes or no whether you have anorexia nervosa. But there are several other clinical features that have been described all the way back into the 1800s. Some of these include heightened levels of anxiety, obsessional thinking, perfectionism, even as in the childhood years. Other things that are less commonly studied, but still clinically recognized, include difficulty recognizing internal body sensations, that would be interoception, as well as difficulty identifying and labeling emotional states, something that's been described as alexithymia. So we'll return to interoception, but I want to talk a little bit more about what we know about anorexia nervosa. So the first is, what are some of the susceptibility and health risks of anorexia nervosa? One thing that we've learned is that it's an incredibly complex condition. There are genetic, biological, psychological, and sociocultural factors, and there's interactions between these that contribute to susceptibility. This is a very nice review that sort of describes the transition from childhood to adolescence to adulthood, the role that puberty and hormonal changes, stress, cultural factors, adolescents learning about their own body image, how those contribute and interact with traits such as perfectionism, a drive for thinness, abnormal interoception, obsessionality, and then lead to changes in eating behaviors, which lead to weight loss, which change the nervous system, and then create this sort of vicious cycle that leads people into a state of chronic illness. So we know that that it's complex. We also know that when you use a structured diagnostic approach, people don't just typically have anorexia nervosa. They will also be diagnosed with an anxiety disorder and/or depression, about 60% of the time. They may also meet criteria for obsessive-compulsive disorder or body dysmorphic disorder. So it's a complex condition. And what that sort of raises is the notion that perhaps the symptom label doesn't really do the best job of explaining what's happening in the brain and what's happening in the body, which means we need to better understand the pathophysiologic mechanisms. But one thing is clear is that these are it's an incredibly deadly disorder that has one of the highest mortality rates of all psychiatric disorders. The lifetime estimate is a 10% mortality rate across the lifetime, which is on par with bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. The other thing I want to emphasize with anorexia nervosa is that it affects women in a ratio of 10 to 1 relative to men. And so there's a lot of emphasis on puberty, on the hormones that are associated with the menstrual cycle onset, as well as cultural factors in terms of what is and isn't considered to be an ideal body shape and type. In terms of the genetics of anorexia nervosa, there's been an increased genetic study of anorexia nervosa using very large samples, what are called genome-wide association studies. This paper in particular was probably the largest study to date on the topic, with over 100,000 individuals who were evaluated. And what we're finding is that there are significant genetic correlations with commonly comorbid, with sort of genes associated with psychiatric disorders like OCD, major depression, anxiety disorder, but also genes that are associated with metabolic function like HDL, the so-called good cholesterol, and as well as genes that are going in the opposite direction in terms of body mass index, fat mass, leptin, and genes that predispose towards high rates of obesity. And these associations and these genetic correlations are actually not confounded by the genetics of BMI. So in these analyses, they're accounting for BMI, since low BMI is in the diagnostic criteria for AN. One interpretation of these outcomes is that the role of metabolic, lipid, and body shape and size traits may suggest that metabolic mechanisms might drive some sort of a physiological resistance to obtaining or maintaining a healthy body weight in AN. But at this point, it's still fairly speculative. In terms of the neurobiology of AN, not surprisingly, it's also very complex, and it seems to involve interactions between multiple neural circuits related to reward, cognition, emotion, learning, taste, and interoception. And I don't have time to go over all of these in detail because it's quite complicated, This is one example from a review focusing on taste processing and how something as simple as like a sweet taste, like a sugar that can stimulate the tongue, goes through the spinal cord, gets from your thalamic relay centers into your gustatory cortex, and then travels through a variety of different brain regions that are related to body perception, memory, conflict monitoring, attention, emotion, planning, learning, that are thought to drive and maintain eating disorders. Now, to try to simplify things, and for the rest of my talk, I'm going to be focusing more on this concept of interoceptive awareness. And models related to that have focused on this notion that the body's sensing of what's happening in the brain sensing of what's happening in the body travels through a pathway that predominantly includes the insular cortex, and that involves the integration of basic tastes with emotional state, with the kinds of drives, homeostatic drives for particular preferred body states, body shapes, body types, that leads to another area of the brain called the striatum, which processes motivation, processes in an associative learning fashion, other information happening in the environment and in the body to then lead to a set of rigid and inflexible behaviors related to food restriction. Now, these circuits can be modified in multiple ways by interoception, by changes in motivation, by changes in anxiety. And most of what I focus on in my lab at this point is really focused on trying to understand the interoception piece. So how do we understand interoception? That's what we're going to talk about next. So one thing I'd like to point out is if you're interested in doing some general reading, you could find a nice link on interoception in Wikipedia. One thing that's immediately obvious is that there are many different physiologic systems that are involved in interoception, like the cardiorespiratory, the gastrointestinal, etc. So hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll feel a little bit more comfortable with some of these concepts. So interoception was defined in this paper by a consensus process as the process by which the nervous system senses, interprets, and integrates signals originating from within the body, providing a moment-by-moment mapping of the body's internal landscape across conscious and unconscious levels. So interoception is important, but also forms the basis for the next step in a homeostatic maintenance process, that of body regulation. Okay, so together, interoception and body regulation support the mobilization of resources to where they're needed in relation to the status of the inner body at both conscious and unconscious levels. Now, interoception can be differentiated from interoceptive awareness, which is a term that you'll see quite frequently in the scientific literature, which relates to the process of conscious sensation interpretation and integration of information about the state of inner body systems. So if I asked you right now to tell me how you were feeling your heartbeat, that would require you to attend to your heartbeat sensation and report on your awareness of the state of your heartbeat, whether or not what you were actually describing was adequately or accurately related to what you were feeling. Now, I also want to emphasize that interoception is a neural process that traverses different levels, from sensors in the body that are molecular, that deal with different types of stimuli originating from, as I said, from within the body, to different neural pathways that lead to neural tissue, so nervous cells that are organized and anatomically interconnected into different networks, like an autonomic network, a somatic, or an enteric, that lead to the body and the brain processing a particular function. Now, the function of these networks is what we call a circuit. So you can have an appetitive circuit, an arousal circuit, an affective circuit. You have many different types of circuits in the body and the brain. And from an interoceptive standpoint, the neural circuits of interoception involve these peripheral all the way up to these central neural tissues that are located in the brain and spinal cord, but also in the peripheral nervous system. Now, finally, you have this concept of awareness. And again, that's what somebody will consciously be able to report about their sense of their internal body state. And it's about their own internal body state as opposed to the state of a living or a non-living object. So it's very much a self-related awareness. But there are also many non-conscious processes in the body that are at play that have a fundamental role in ensuring interoceptive homeostasis. So you might not, for example, be able to tell me what your blood pH level is, right? Or your blood sugar level, although there may be times when you realize that you're getting hungry because your blood sugar is decreasing. So again, there's lots of homeostatic maintenance that your autonomic nervous system is doing in your brainstem beneath the level of awareness. And when we talk about some of the major brain regions involved in interoceptive processing, there's actually quite a bit of them. Probably the most common one that you'll see in the literature is the insular cortex. And I've shown this in both human and the mouse because there's actually quite a lot of research happening these days in the animal literature on interoception. We're making a lot of advances in our understanding, particularly of the neural circuits going from visceral organs into the brainstem, whereas most of the work in humans has really made advances in cortical and subcortical areas. The other thing you'll notice here is that there's this notion of a brain-body feedback loop. So interoception forms the basis for subsequent regulation. It's sort of, although I'm emphasizing the afferent limb of this process in my description about interoception, there's a great interest in understanding the regulatory or efferent limb of this loop, particularly in the search for improved therapies for various psychiatric disorders and diseases. We'll also talk a little bit about some of the other areas like the medial prefrontal cortex later on. So now the perceptual processing of interoceptive sensations is tightly regulated. So most of the time we're unaware of the physiological state of our bodies, but when sufficient physiologic deviation occurs, our nervous system makes us acutely aware of such feelings. And that allows us to take the corrective action to regulate and restore homeostatic balance. So here you can see just a few examples of interoceptive sensations that are relevant for eating disorders. And one argument is that in pathologic cases, this balance is disrupted such that the organism shifts from a reactive regulatory strategy to an anticipatory regulatory strategy, which is called allostatic dysfunction. Now, how do we optimally assess interoception? This is from a review that I published a number of years ago, just making the case for something as simple as the heartbeat sensation, that I could ask you, for example, to just pay attention to your feeling of your heartbeat. And that would be sort of a heartbeat attention task. Whereas I could ask you to count your heartbeat sensations or press a button every time you felt one. And basically what you can see is that there are different features of interoception that would be measured by each of these different cognitive processes. What I would like to argue is that the optimal assessment includes both minimalistic as well as maximal approaches where you can actually take the state of the body and perturb a signal, so manipulate the heart rate, for example, and see how intensely people experience these sensations. And I'll give some examples of how we've done that in the lab shortly. However, as you saw in the intro, there's a lot of different interoceptive systems. So it's not just about your heartbeat. There's also respiratory signals, gastrointestinal, etc. And one of the challenges that we have is that these signals vary in terms of their frequency as well as their amplitude, and they do so simultaneously, such that whether you're talking about the cardiovascular, the respiratory, gastrointestinal, or urinary or immune systems, your brain and the rest of your nervous system are receiving a lot of complex signals in real time. So our nervous system and our brains are doing a complicated amount of computations that lead us to simple judgments such as, is my heart beating fast or not? Am I hungry or not? And that's been some of the challenge in making progress. I'd like to highlight some of the basic neuroscience studies in my lab where we focused on heart and gut-brain signaling in eating disorders. In particular, focused on these sort of organ systems. So For the first one, if you're listening along and you're not asleep yet, I would say maybe try taking a deep breath and try holding your breath as I explain the next study. It'll be very relevant. So we did that with a group of individuals with eating disorders, anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, binge eating disorder in a large study conducted at our institute. And what we asked people to do simply was just to tell us what they felt, right? How much suffocation do you feel? How much do you fear that you're about to suffocate? Even though they're just simply holding their breath for as long as they can. And what we found is that the individuals with mood and anxiety disorders, so mood and anxiety in blue and the eating disorders in the salmon color, reported greater feelings of suffocation and suffocation fear than their demographically matched healthy comparison counterparts. This was about 51 per group. However, the eating disorder group actually showed higher feelings of suffocation than even the mood and anxiety group, who showed higher suffocation feelings than the healthy comparison group. Now, these individuals could exhale anytime they wanted. So it wasn't that they were not in control of this form of aversive sensation. They could exhale whenever they wanted. We also tested them in relation to how they felt another aversive physical sensation, a cold presser task where we had them dunk their hand in a bucket of ice water. And there we actually didn't see any group differences in pain response or hand withdrawal behaviors across the group. So there seemed to be something specific to respiratory sensations in the eating disorder group. And it seemed to be associated with anxiety. So this is just an example showing that the eating disorder group was the only one that showed this selective association where with anxiety sensitivity. So the tendency to be aversive to physical triggers of anxiety. So the more sensitive they were to these physical triggers, the more they reported a fear of being suffocated, even though they were the ones choosing to hold their own breath. So that would be one form of what I would call an endogenous perturbation. We've done other studies where we've used what are so-called exogenous perturbations, where we're able to manipulate the state of the body, perturb people beyond a homeostatic baseline state outside of their level of awareness and control. And I'll show you that next. So this allows us to take advantage of measurement of the brain's response to an interoceptive stress. You may be familiar with the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA stress axis, where the brain, in response to stress, pushes the adrenal glands to release stress hormones such as cortisol or epinephrine and norepinephrine. There's been a lot of focus on understanding stress mechanisms in the brain and stress signaling with cortisol, because cortisol can cross into the brain and into the basically the nucleus and change gene expression and the translation of new proteins. So these are sort of long-acting stress effects in the brain. There's been relatively less emphasis on epinephrine and norepinephrine, which is more of a short-acting way of trying to understand the stress response. So the approach that I've taken in the lab is to try to use a short-term stressor that manipulates and mimics kind of the effects of an acute physiologic stress similar to anxiety, using a drug called isoproterenol, which you see shown here. So this is the chemical structure for epinephrine. You may also know it as adrenaline. It's a fight or flight neurotransmitter. Isoproterenol has a similar structure, except that the addition of this component here prevents it from crossing into the blood-brain barrier very easily. So it actually acts as a peripheral stimulant on beta adrenergic receptors that are located in the heart and lungs. So this allows us to manipulate the state of the body and then examine what happens in the brain and what happens to perception. We've been because I'm a psychiatrist and interested in symptoms and what people perceive, right? Symptoms are what bring our patients into the clinic. That's what are often most bothersome to individuals about their condition. So we try to understand, how does perceiving the state of the body relate to anorexia nervosa? So with this experimental paradigm, what we do is we bring people into the lab and we provide an intravenous infusion of isoproterenol or saline And that's what we're showing over here. So isoproterenol works very quickly. This red line here is the heart rate response. Heart rate normally ranges from 60 to 100 beats a minute. People receive an infusion, they don't know what's in it. This is an example of a 2 microgram dose where you can see you get a very nice and very rapid heart rate response that comes back down to baseline. And what people are doing here is they're actually turning a dial in real time to rate the overall intensity of their heartbeat and breathing sensations from a level of 0 to 10. What you can see is you get a nice peak response in the heart rate that coincides to the change in sensation, albeit with a bit delay. We also can give people different doses, so we can induce lower heart rate responses or higher responses, and we can also give people saline, which is to look at the effects of their expectation about what would happen in the absence of an actual manipulation. So we've done this in individuals with anorexia nervosa. This was the first study that we did. And what we did was we looked at the effect of meal context. So prior to eating a large meal that would be considered anxiety provoking versus after the meal. What you can see here is that we're able to manipulate the ability of people to detect, yes, there is something happening in my heart with my heartbeat. Everybody is sort of feeling a dose-related increase. The difference that we found in this study is that the individuals with anorexia nervosa also reported a heightened sensation in their body during the saline condition when we hadn't manipulated any part of their cardiovascular system. But importantly, this was only when they were anticipating a meal state. It did not happen any longer after they had eaten a meal, suggesting that there's something about the anticipatory process and the onset of the meal that is particularly scrambling their interoceptive processing. We did a follow-up study here where we actually looked at the character of the sensations, and we found that these individuals actually had quite a bit of physiologic localization of the sensation to their body, even in the absence of stimulation. So we called these visceral illusions, and overall we sort of interpreted that that abnormal respiratory and cardiac interoception is indeed a common but somewhat overlooked clinical feature of eating disorders. Now we've continued to use this protocol to try to understand what's happening in the brain. And here's some unpublished data that we're working on that basically shows that we see a focal hyperactivation in an area of the brain called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So it's not just the visceral illusions in saline. We see heightened perceptual sensation and a heightened response in another area of the brain called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And we see that this area seems to be tightly associated with changes in the perception of the heartbeat sensation in the anorexia nervosa individuals, but not so much in those who are unaffected by the condition. So there seems to be an abnormality in the brain processing of cardiovascular sensations at the level of ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And it suggests that this is an area that may be worth targeting in future neuroscience-based treatment interventions. I will mention that we do also find the insular cortex is activated in both individuals, but we don't actually see any group differences. So we think that it may be something specific in the condition related to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Now, we're getting close to the end, and I want to finish by introducing sort of the latest approach that I'm quite excited about in terms of our basic neuroscience studies. And that it focuses on this notion of gastrointestinal interoception. One of the most common things clinically is not heartbeat sensation changes or breathing sensation changes, but it's really abnormalities of gastrointestinal perception, such as premature fullness, premature bloating, constipation, and understanding these kinds of perceptions from a clinical standpoint in psychiatry is really difficult without resorting to some invasive means, such as swallowing inflatable balloons or placing balloons anorectally. So I've been working a lot on thinking about a new approach of how we can better understand gastrointestinal perception. And, you know, one of the things that is relevant for gastrointestinal interoception is this notion that eating is a process that begins well before the act of consumption. For example, if you're going down the supermarket, you may be, thinking about what you might want to eat, conjuring up associations of what the food is going to look like or taste like. You may be selecting one set of food over another, but then you're going to have to actually eat it. And so these phases of eating can be divided into a cephalic phase and then an ingestive phase. And eating certainly has this remarkable checkpoint where you have to take food into your body, and then you have to decide, do I really want this? You take it into your mouth, and then do I want to swallow or do I not want to swallow? Once you've decided the food is not harmful, you'll swallow, and the phases of eating continue through esophageal transit, and there's all kinds of digestive processes that are happening. The question is, how do we understand the clinical reports of premature fullness and bloating and cramping in the abdomen if we don't have good measures that can get us into the gastrointestinal system, particularly in psychiatry in a manner that's non-invasive? So one of the things that we've done recently is develop an approach for measuring human gut feelings that involves this device, which is a vibrating capsule. So this was actually developed by a company to try to treat and improve chronic constipation. The idea is that there's a little battery and a motor in here, and you swallow it, and after about 8 hours, it gets into the vicinity of the colon and rattles around and improves your gut contractility. Well, what we've done is we've changed the parameters on this capsule so that it, shortly after you swallow it, when it's presumably in the stomach, it starts vibrating. And we ask participants to simply press a button to tell us whether they feel a vibration or not that they associate with the capsule. We've done this in 40 healthy individuals displayed here. And what we've shown is that we can do a signal detection analysis, and we can see that most people are actually above chance in their ability to detect the normal level of sensation from the chronic constipation studies. Then when we deliver a higher amount of stimulation, we see that we can actually increase people's ability to sense that with a reduced reaction time. So that's potentially exciting, but what does it do in the brain? What we've seen, this is not compatible with functional MRI, so we've had to use something called electroencephalography. And what we've seen is that we see a kind of a nice dose-related or vibration-related response in the brain that's localized to a posterior midline area of the brain with activity that shows sort of the brain activity shows a positive association with the perceptual responses, both in terms of this perceptual accuracy as well as the latency of the brain response. So the idea is that this is a sort of basic platform for studying an enterically focused sensory monitoring within the human brain. And it's minimally invasive. This could be done in an easy laboratory setting, potentially a clinical setting eventually. And we're doing some ongoing work trying to understand what's the association in eating disorders. Are patients more sensitive or less sensitive? And if I were to sort of take a poll in the room, I would imagine that most people in the room would suggest that their patients are more sensitive. But in our early work, what we're actually seeing, and this is a very small sample, we've collected a lot more data, and we're in the process of analyzing, but our preliminary data is suggesting that individuals with AN are actually less sensitive at perceiving this particular novel form of stimulation, but that when we increase the stimulation, we can actually rescue, in some cases substantially so, the amount of perceptual sensation, and we can do it in a way that does not impact peripheral physiology. So my hope is that this will be a tool for helping us understand whether individuals with AN, again, at the individual patient level, have impaired gut feelings. I'd like to see whether we can use this to establish biological markers, in other words, associate it with illness severity, perform predictive studies to see whether the amount of visceral acuity tells us how ill somebody will be in the future, and potentially even develop treatment approaches where we could potentially give people feedback and hopefully rescue their ability to sense and be more sensitive to what's happening in their gut, and to see whether that has an impact on their perception. So this is the map of the interoceptive brain regions that I showed you. We actually think now that there's another area that we can add to the map. I didn't have time to go over some of the additional studies in the literature, but we think that this midline posterior parieto-occipital area is important. And we certainly think that there are other areas of the brain that are going to be important in the future as well. And to summarize, we started out by realizing that human feeding behaviors have changed substantially over several millennia. Abnormal eating behaviors have been increasingly identified in recent decades, some of which are diagnosed as eating disorders, but certainly not all, such as the obesity epidemic. Interoceptive neuroscience, I believe, holds promise for a neurophysiologically grounded understanding of eating disorders, and I've shown you some of the literature from my lab that's coming out that hopes to make this more of a reality. For those people who are interested in studying interoception, I would argue that approaches that involve perturbations of signals are really important for this physiologically informed understanding, and especially for eating disorders. My hope is that these approaches will inform the future translation of translational development, not only of tools, but also clinical treatments. And there's another line of research in my laboratory that is focused on treatment development. I didn't have time to talk about that, including some work that has been graciously funded by the BBRF Foundation. But perhaps if I'm able to in another time, share some of this information with you. But I would like to finish by saying we really have only begun to explore the vastness of inner space. I hope that you've learned something about interoception, about eating disorders. I'd like to thank my collaborators, the BBRF, for the opportunity to speak, and I will take questions.
Well, first of all, let me just say that this was an excellent presentation, and I appreciate you taking very complicated issues and making it understandable for a lay audience. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for the work that you're doing. I guess one question would be, where is this going to lead in terms of future treatment? Because while we do have effective treatments for anorexia nervosa, we really would benefit from even better treatments. Where do you see this leading?
Yeah, so to the point of effective treatments, we have treatments that are somewhat effective, but the truth is that even after receiving state-of-the-art evidence-based treatment, roughly half of the individuals with anorexia nervosa who receive that treatment will relapse within 1 to 2 years. And part of it, I think, is related to the complexity of the disorders, but part of it is related to the fact that we are incomplete in our understanding of these pathophysiologic mechanisms. So my hope for one example of this would be that if we can develop better assays or better tests of an individual's ability to adequately sense the signals within their body. So can they adequately sense hunger signals? Can they adequately sense, oh, you know, I ate, you know, 2 or 3 bites of food, and while my eating disorder is telling me that I'm full, I can actually feel that I need more caloric input, that I can feel that my stomach is not distended to the point of fullness, that there's more room, right? So in one line of research in the future, I would hope that we can develop treatments, tests and treatments that are able to give a clinician an individual indicator. Oh, you know, you are somebody who, beyond your body image disturbance, beyond your drive and the reward you feel from restricting your eating, physiologically, your processing of the food stimulus, of the associated sensations is abnormal, and we're going to work with you to connect your perception in a better way to what your body needs. Okay, that would be one hope. The other hope is that we develop treatments that are more comprehensively able to address all of the various symptoms that are relevant for a particular individual who has a diagnosis of an eating disorder. So many people have, as I mentioned, have comorbid anxiety disorders. And I didn't go into this, but our anxiety treatments at the level of medications, so medications that work very effectively for reducing anxiety in anxiety disordered individuals, like benzodiazepine medications as a short-term option, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors as a longer-term option, they don't work very well in eating disorders. And so can we come up with treatments that are more effective at reducing anxiety in these individuals, and can we leverage those approaches in a synergistic manner to address some of the other eating disorder related cognitions and food related behaviors that sort of reinforce the behavior, the abnormal eating. So again, it's sort of taking a more comprehensive approach, one where we step back and we say, okay, what are all of the neural systems and all of the physiologic parameters that are involved, and how can we put some of these things together? So it may not always look like a new treatment that is a standalone. It may be a tool. It may be something that we augment, that we use in combination with existing treatments, but it's one that takes a broader appreciation of all of the aspects of abnormality that we see in these individuals.
But thank you for that overview. Another question relates to, often it's difficult to get somebody who has anorexia into treatment. Their loved ones realize there's a problem. They may or may not realize it. They may not want to be in treatment. What do you suggest to family members, friends of someone who's concerned about how do they get their loved one to begin treatment?
That's a great question, and I think it's one in which you try to maintain your connection and your communication and an acceptance of the individual and their experience intact. So it's very hard to see somebody who has a misattribution or a misperception of themselves, who may be in denial of their condition, or who just, they may see it, but they're just not ready to receive treatment. So I think sometimes you can actually lose out by pointing these things out, by pushing and pushing. So I think that finding a way to accept the reality of the person, of where they are, and recognize that you may want them to receive treatment now, but once they finally accept treatment, that's just the beginning of a very long process of recovery. As I mentioned, with the relapse rates being 50% within the first year or two, it may take somebody 3 or 4 inpatient hospitalizations and 5 to 7 years of treatment before they get to the point where they and their treatment providers consider themselves recovered. So if you're thinking about, well, this, I think this person needs treatment, it's the end of the world if they don't get treatment, today, maybe stepping back and realizing, well, is this a medical emergency? Could they receive treatment a week from now or a month from now and still be on that path to recovery?
Very good guidance, very good guidance. And I think to some degree, putting yourself in that person's shoes to be able to better understand where they're coming from, that their illness is sort of overtaking the judgment that someone without that illness may have, can be helpful as well. Sahib, I want to thank you for doing this presentation and for the work that you're doing. It offers great hope for people, for families with this condition. So thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'd also like to thank everybody who joined us today. I'd ask you to please consider making a donation to BBRF today. 100% of every dollar donated for research is invested in our research grants. We're able to do this because our operating expenses are covered by separate foundation grants. This means that when you donate $1 for research, that dollar goes directly to the scientists. To make a gift, please visit our website, bbrfoundation.org, or call us at 1-800-829-8289. This webinar has been recorded. If you've missed any portion of the presentation and would like to share it with family and friends, please visit the events and webinars page at our website. And please join us again next month on November 8th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, when Dr. Sakina Rivsvi, Assistant Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto, will present the neurobiology of pain processing and suicide, a potential marker for suicide risk. Thank you again, and remember, together we can dramatically improve the lives of those living with mental illness and enable more people to live full, happy, and productive lives. Take care.